We're now, I think, going to be going back into a period of second regeneration of regenerated brownfield sites. The case I'm going to take is a very simple case. It's entirely fictitious and made up. If there are any names there which actually bear any relation to real people, past or dead, please forgive me, they're not intended. It's very simplistic. We have a factory producing something. We have a flue. We have some landscaping on site. We have some tanks, and we have a border with a canalized stream or river. We are the heartland of the Industrial Revolution. Most of our land, particularly industrial land, has been used 2 or 3 or even more times. So even given that simple scenario, buried beneath the surface, we've probably got a nice little cocktail of underground storage tanks, some of which may or may not be in use, some of which we may or may not know what they were used for, most of which we won't have a clue. It is possible to insure, by the way, for unknown underground storage tanks, regardless of whether or not we have that information. So let's look at pre-1990. In terms of risk management of the asbestos risk or any environmental risk, not a lot really. As Richard alluded to the fact, the classic situation was bulldoze the lot, probably stockpile it. We then went through, if you remember, and unfortunately I do, an economic recession. So those sites tended to hang around for quite a while, which means you then almost certainly had fly tipping on the sites. Guess what? Much of that fly tipping contained asbestos-containing materials or demolition rubble. And that was the sort of pre-site redevelopment, site demolition stage at that time. In terms of the site preparation, level it. You did have it concentrated in a nice heap. Now let's spread it all over the site. And in fact, it was very often the case that they would bring in hardcore, possibly to improve the levels for flood purposes. And that hardcore was hardly, if ever, tested with regard to the material which was being brought on. If we look at the early 1990s and our starting point, we still had the situation whereby effectively there was leveling of the buildings on the site and stockpiling. However, we were at the stage where we had had the introduction of the Environmental Protection Act 1990. People were starting to become aware of this environmental liability risk. And because right back then, we still had the same problem we're struggling with today in terms of what's legal, and because of the valuation of the site asset, the tendency was always to go towards complete removal of the risk as far as that was possibly achievable. What we saw was removal of contamination as far as it was identified. Usually it was taken off site and disposed off off the site. So now, instead of one piece of contaminated land, we had 2 pieces of contaminated land, which of course left a void, and which hardcore material was very often brought on. Sometimes it was PFA, but very often it was building debris, almost none of which was ever tested. So it's quite possible that in many of these sites you brought on worse material than was actually taken off, as insane as that sounds.